One thing, I don't think anyone could have listened to that and not notice that you're an incredibly funny writer. Like, it's so humorous. It's fantastic. So I'm curious, in your writing process, do you start by thinking of like the humor of a situation or like the dialogue that you want to get on the page? Or do you start more with characters or plot or setting and then the humor comes at a later date?
Yeah, I actually, because this is the first book in the series, and so as I've gotten to know some of the other siblings in the Astley family who are going to make up the later books, I often think of a really great line of dialogue, and I think, I often, this is going to sound crazy, but the other day I went to New Braunfels for a book sale, and it was about an hour drive, and I drove down there without listening to any music because I just like to brainstorm, and I just talked to myself out loud as I was driving along in the car, brainstorming ideas for these books, and that's how I come up with a lot of these lines of dialogue. I'll just be washing the dishes or something, or like sometimes I work out with no music and I just talk to myself the whole time. And it's funny what will come out of your brain when you give yourself space to just spitball things and throw them out there. So I oftentimes have these lines of dialogue that I know I want to work in there somewhere. And then my brain goes, which scene does this fit in? How does this work out? How does this funny exchange work? So I kind of start from the characters. And then once I have the characters and kind of know what their dynamic will be together, I often come up with the lines of dialogue and then figure out where those fit like puzzle pieces.
That's fascinating.
Mhm.
Wow. I one time have walked around. I live in New York City, so I don't have a
Mhm.
car. One time I walked around, I was really struggling with a draft, needed to figure out how it ended, and I was walking around talking out loud to myself on the sidewalks of New York City, being like, "But if this happens, that won't work, and if this happens, that won't work." Nobody looked twice. But
Exactly. It's New York.
that's amazing. So dialogue is such a tricky part of the craft to get right, so have you
Mhm.
done do you feel it sounds like dialogue comes naturally to you, but I'm curious whether there are any like craft books or exercises that you do to really, perfect that skill.
Oh gosh. I mean, I definitely try and think about what are sort of what is this character's voice? What are some of their signature words that they use? I actually got myself into a little bit of trouble because the lady's maid character there, Fanny, in the original draft, she had a much larger role in the book, and she's from Kent. So I read an entire book on the 19th century Kentish dialogue. And I made all of these notes about all of these words I was going to use for her and how the dialogue was. And then I have this wonderful reader named Linda from Britain who reads all my drafts for me and lets me know when I've used a word that sounds particularly American, for example. And she's like, this Fanny character, she just sounds weird. And she even went and checked with one of her friends from Kent, and she's like, he doesn't know any of these words. He didn't hear his grandparents using them. This just sounds strange, Courtney. I'm going, what happened? So I did some further research. And about 100 years ago, the Cockney accent moved east from London and completely subsumed the Kentish dialect that I had written this entire
Oh,
character in. So no one has heard this dialect for 200 years. It sounds completely bizarre. People in Kent do not speak that way anymore. And yet I have this character using all of these strange words that no longer exist. I'm like, okay, good job. Tried a little too hard with that one, but what can you do?
that's really funny, and it's also kind of like a classic example of the tension between like doing your research and then also making it accessible to modern readers because
Exactly.
we're not actually reading to learn about 19th century Kent.
And I thought I was doing this great thing. I thought, oh, everybody in Kent is going to say, oh, my grandfather used to use that word, and this has such a familiar feel. It turns out no one recognizes it at all, and it just sounds weird, but it's too late. That's how I hear the character in my head now. So I actually just came out with a novella which features Fanny as the heroine. And so I tried to tone it down to a level that was accessible, but I have a few ya knows and yes sees in there of this
I
old
love
Kentish.
that. I love that. That's awesome. So speaking of research, the
Mhm.
it didn't come up too much in this scene in particular. There was the mention of the different museums and the bog hand and all of that. But this is such a fun premise of a story that's, got this like Indiana Jones aspect of going through these artifacts or whatnot. Like, how much research did you have to do on all these ancient worlds and artifacts that they would be coming across versus how much of it did it end up in the book? Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I did. I actually did quite a bit of research into it because all of the ancient Egyptology parts in the book are factually correct. You know, the Rosetta Stone really did come to Britain in that year, and it caused an Egyptomania, is what they call it, craze, in which everyone was all of a sudden obsessed with these ancient Egyptian antiquities. And Thomas Hope, who's mentioned in the book, was very famous for his ancient Egyptian decor at his house. The party at Thomas Hope's house was an actual event that took place, and I actually quoted a little newspaper column writing it up about how there were 1,000 guests in attendance, including the Prince of Wales. So this was an actual craze that took place in the very year that the book is set. So I did quite a lot of research on that. At the same time, you always try to be mindful. Hey, this is a romance novel. People are not here to read details about Egyptian entrails and all of this stuff. So you try and find that right balance between giving it a little bit of historical color, but letting the romance really lead the way.
Yeah. And so you mentioned this is the first book in the series, and clearly this Egyptology has informed the plot. Do you feel that you also, because I do this a lot where I'm reading about the era and that helps me figure out what I want my next book to be. Do
Mm-hmm.
you use that as inspiration?
Absolutely. I always have a historical research book, a history book that I'm reading, and it's amazing if you just read history. It's amazing how ideas pop out at you. You just go, "Oh, this would be perfect for this book, and this would be perfect." So I just find that if I'm reading something, the ideas just tend to flow. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I actually realized once I started writing my historical romances, getting back into the research part of it, I realized that something I have always done when reading nonfiction history is to imagine people living in the time and like, oh, how would they have reacted to this really huge thing that happened? And I was like, oh, so this explains why I have chosen the career that I have
exactly.
chosen.
No mystery how you got here.